13-year-old boy walks into a biker garage carrying shattered pieces of a toy car and asks one question: "Can you fix it?" It's all she has left. What the men don't know is that the toy didn't break by accident. At home, silence has become routine, fear keeps a mother frozen, and going back isn't the safest option. Fixing the toy is the easy part. The sound came first, a crack like a gunshot that made Steve's heart slam against his ribs. He was at the kitchen table, pretending to focus on algebra homework he'd finished an hour ago, but really he'd been monitoring the rising tension in his stepfather's voice from the living room. His sister, Laura, had been playing with the remote car in the hallway, making soft engine noises under her breath. It was the first sound she'd made all day that wasn't a one-word answer. Then the yelling started. "I told you to keep that garbage out of the common areas." His stepfather's voice boomed through the house. "It's trash. Just like everything from that man." Steve was moving before he could think, but he wasn't fast enough. By the time he reached the hallway, his stepfather's boot was already coming down. The plastic body of the car splintered under the impact, pieces skittering across the hardwood. Lara's scream cut through everything, raw and animal, the kind of sound she hadn't made since the funeral. "It's junk anyway," his stepfather said, breathing hard, his face red. "About time someone threw it out. Your father's not coming back to get it." Steve saw his mother in the doorway to the kitchen, one hand pressed against the frame like she needed it to stay upright. Her mouth opened, closed. An apology formed on her lips. Steve could see it happening, the familiar calculation behind her eyes. How angry was he? How much worse would it get if she spoke? Could they afford for him to storm out again when rent was due next week? She said nothing. Laura dropped to her knees, gathering pieces with shaking hands. A wheel, part of the chassis. The tiny steering mechanism their dad had spent an evening installing, explaining gear ratios to a 7-year-old who didn't understand but loved listening anyway. Steve knelt beside her, helped collect the fragments while his stepfather watched with his arms crossed. "Clean it up and throw it away," he said finally, and walked back to the living room like he'd just taken out actual trash. Their mother's whisper was almost worse than her silence. "Laura, honey, it was old anyway. Maybe we can." But Laura was already moving, crawling under her bed with the pieces clutched against her chest. Steve followed her to the doorway of the room they used to have separate before they moved here, before their mother remarried a man who promised stability and delivered something else entirely. "Leave her," his mother said quietly behind him. "She needs time. We all just need time." That night, after his mother had gone to bed and his stepfather's snoring rattled through the thin walls, Steve lay awake staring at the ceiling. He could hear Laura in the bunk below him. She'd stopped crying months ago, but her breathing had that careful, controlled quality that sounded like holding everything inside took physical effort. He thought about the car. His dad had bought it at a yard sale and spent 3 weekends fixing it, teaching Steve about circuits and batteries while Laura watched from her perch on the workbench. "Most things aren't really broken," his dad had said, soldering a loose connection. "They just need someone who cares enough to figure out what's wrong." The funeral had been 18 months ago. The remarriage was 8 months ago. The first time his stepfather's voice made their mother flinch was 6 months ago. The pattern was easy to track if you were paying attention, and Steve was always paying attention now. His mother's logic made a certain sense, he knew. They couldn't afford this apartment on her salary alone. His stepfather had never hit them. Just objects, just walls, just their sense of safety. She was doing her best. She was tired. She was scared. But Laura hadn't drawn a picture since the car broke. She used to fill notebooks with elaborate scenes, the car racing through jungles across oceans into space. Now the notebooks sat empty. Steve made his decision somewhere around 3 in the morning. He'd seen the garage on his way to school, the Iron Talons motorcycle club building with its bay doors often open, bikers working on machines that looked like they'd been rebuilt 100 times. There was something about the way they handled broken things, careful, patient, like the fixing mattered as much as the finished product. When morning came, Steve packed the pieces into his backpack, each fragment wrapped in tissue paper like it was precious. His mother was making breakfast, moving quietly so she wouldn't wake his stepfather before she left for her early shift. "Going to the library," Steve said, which wasn't quite a lie. He might go there after. She nodded without looking up, and Steve saw the bruise on her wrist she was trying to hide with her sleeve. The bruise came from flinching away so hard she'd hit the counter edge. He knew because he'd watched it happen. "Steve," she said as he reached the door. He turned. She was looking at him now, and for a second he thought she was going to ask where he was really going to see through him the way she used to before exhaustion made her vision narrow. "Be safe." "Always am," he said, and stepped into the morning air. The walk to the garage took 40 minutes. His backpack felt heavier with every block, but Steve didn't slow down. He was carrying more than broken plastic. He was carrying the last piece of his father, the last spark of his sister, and a question he hoped someone knew how to answer. Could you fix it? It wasn't just a question about the car. They both knew that. The garage smelled like oil, metal, and strong coffee when Steve pushed through the door that Saturday morning. The Iron Talons MC building was bigger inside than it looked from the street. High ceilings, tools hanging on pegboards, 3 motorcycles in various states of disassembly. 4 men looked up from their work, their leather vests marked with patches and insignia Steve didn't understand. He almost turned around. But then one of them, a man with gray threading through his dark beard and scars mapping his knuckles, simply nodded toward an empty workbench near the back. The man asked nothing, suspected nothing. He simply offered an invitation with that nod. Steve crossed the concrete floor, his sneakers squeaking slightly. He set his backpack down and began removing the pieces, arranging them carefully on the scarred wood surface. The remote control, miraculously intact. The shattered chassis. The wheels, 1 bent, 3 fine. The tiny motor that had somehow survived. What happened here? The bearded man had appeared beside him, crouching so they were at eye level. His voice was rough but not unkind. Steve kept his eyes on the pieces. "It broke." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded like that answer was enough. "I'm Luther. You know anything about circuits?" "A little. My dad taught me some." "Good. That's a start." Luther pulled up a stool, gestured for Steve to sit, and began pointing out what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. His hands were huge, scarred and calloused, but they moved over the tiny components with surprising gentleness. That first morning stretched into 3 hours. Luther showed Steve how to test the motor with a multimeter, how to identify which wires went where, how to see the logic in what looked like chaos. The other bikers worked around them, occasionally offering advice or a different tool. Nobody asked about Steve's parents. Nobody questioned why a 13-year-old had walked into their garage on a Saturday morning. Steve left before noon, the pieces packed away again but organized now, cataloged. He'd learned more in 3 hours than he had in months of shop class. He came back the next Saturday. And the next. Pattern developed. Steve arrived early each Saturday morning and worked until late morning, always checking his phone, always leaving on schedule. The bikers started saving him a spot at the workbench, leaving out the tools he'd need. One of them, a woman named Rita with silver rings on every finger, began bringing extra pastries from the bakery she managed. "Take them home," she'd say, pressing a bag into his hands. "Share with your family." Steve always thanked her, but Luther noticed the boy never ate any himself. The bag would sit unopened beside his backpack until he left, saving them for later, saving them for someone else. By the 4th week, the car was taking shape. The chassis had been reinforced with spare parts from an old RC helicopter. The motor was running smooth. Steve had learned to solder, his hands steady as he reconnected circuits his stepfather's boot had severed. "Your folks know you're here?" Luther asked one morning, watching Steve test the steering mechanism. Steve's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. "My mom knows I'm out." It wasn't quite a lie, and Luther heard what lived in that space between truth and deception. He'd raised a daughter, lost her too young to cancer that moved faster than hope, and he recognized the sound of a kid carrying weight that didn't belong to him. "You're welcome here," Luther said simply. "Anytime." Steve nodded, not looking up, and Luther saw the boy's throat work as he swallowed. The following Saturday, Steve was 20 minutes late. He burst through the door slightly out of breath, apologizing, explaining there'd been a situation at home. Nothing serious, just took longer to leave than expected. His hands shook slightly as he unpacked his backpack. Luther didn't push, but he started paying closer attention. The way Steve positioned himself so he could always see the door. The way he flinched when one of the bikers dropped a wrench and it clanged against the concrete. The careful way he avoided talking about home beyond the vaguest details. Then, one afternoon in late spring, a sedan pulled into the parking lot and just sat there, engine running. Steve's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and something in his expression shifted. Not fear exactly, but a kind of resignation. "I have to go," he said, already packing up. Luther walked outside with him, intending only to say goodbye, maybe meet whoever was waiting. As they approached the car, he could see a woman in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Steve's mother. "Mom, this is Luther. He's been helping me with—" "We need to go," she said, her voice thin. "Now, Steve." Luther raised his hand in a friendly wave, took a step closer to introduce himself properly. She flinched, a quick, involuntary movement that made her turn her head away. She flinched away from the approach itself, the proximity, the possibility of something her body had learned to expect. Luther stopped immediately, kept his hands visible, his voice soft. "Ma'am, just wanted to say your son's welcome here anytime. He's good with his hands. Smart kid." She nodded without making eye contact, her fingers white on the steering wheel. Steve climbed into the passenger seat, and before he could even close the door properly, she was backing out, turning, leaving. Through the rear window, Luther saw Steve mouth sorry before they disappeared around the corner. Luther stood in the parking lot for a long moment, his jaw tight. He'd seen that particular flavor of fear before. In his late wife's sister, who'd worn sunglasses indoors for 2 years. In his daughter's friend's mother, who'd always had an excuse for the bruises. He walked back inside, where Rita was watching from the doorway. "That boy's in trouble," she said quietly. "Yeah," Luther agreed. "He is." The toy car was nearly complete by mid-June. The chassis gleamed with fresh paint, Lara's favorite color, purple, which Steve had mentioned once and Luther had somehow remembered. The motor purred smoothly when tested. All it needed was final assembly and the decal Steve was carefully applying, replicas of the ones his father had placed years ago. But the real progress was harder to measure. Steve had started talking more during those Saturday mornings, small details slipping out between soldering connections and tightening screws. How Lara used to race the car down their old hallway, the one in the house they'd lived in before, when their dad would get down on his knees and make commentary like a sports announcer. How she'd make engine noises, different pitches for accelerating, downshifting, taking corners. How she hadn't done any of that since the funeral. "She draws sometimes," Steve said one morning, fitting a wheel onto its axle. "Used to, anyway. These elaborate scenes with the car in them. Racing through crazy places. Jungles underwater. Flying through clouds. Used to." Rita asked from where she was organizing the tool wall. She stopped after. Steve didn't finish the sentence, but his hands had gone still. Luther exchanged a look with Rita, both wondering what had really stopped Lara's drawings. Steve recovered, kept working. "Anyway, I've been teaching myself to cook. Someone has to, and Mom works a lot. Double shifts mostly. Keeps us afloat." The details accumulated over weeks like pieces of a puzzle. The house was quieter now than it used to be. They couldn't afford to move even though the apartment was too small. Steve's mom was always tired. His stepfather worked construction, irregular hours, came home in moods that shifted like weather. Luther shared his own story one afternoon while they installed the car's new battery pack. How his daughter Lily had died at 7, leukemia that moved through her small body like wildfire. How his wife had never recovered from watching their child disappear by degrees. How she'd been there physically but absent in every way that mattered until one day she just wasn't there at all. Moved across the country to start over somewhere Lily's ghost didn't live in every corner. "Grief does strange things," Luther said, testing the connection. Makes people freeze up. Makes them survive instead of live. Steve nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without additional words needed. The next Saturday, Steve brought drawings. Lara's drawings. He spread them across the workbench, elaborate pencil sketches of the remote car in fantastical landscapes. But Rita, who'd taken child psychology classes years ago when she'd considered teaching, noticed something Steve might have missed. In every picture, the car was racing away from something. A dark shape in the background. A shadow with reaching hands. Storm clouds with teeth. Your sister drew all these? Rita asked carefully. Yeah, she's really good, right? She hasn't done any new ones lately, but I kept these. Rita photographed several of the drawings with her phone, told Steve they were beautiful, helped him pack them away safely. Later, after Steve had left for the day, she made a phone call to a school counselor she'd worked with through the community center. A woman named Dr. Matthews who specialized in childhood trauma. I'm not saying anything definite, Rita explained, but there's a family that might need someone to check in. The kind that won't ask for help themselves. Dr. Matthews listened, took notes, promised to look into it carefully. She'd already noticed Lara in her building, the quiet 10-year-old who walked through hallways like she was trying not to take up space, who hadn't spoken in class beyond necessary responses since January. Back at the garage, Luther had started keeping a log. Nothing official, just notes on dates and patterns he couldn't ignore. Dates: Steve arrived late with new bruises. Never on his face, always places a shirt would cover. Times he mentioned his mom, not feeling well, or having a headache, that kept her in bed. The Saturday Steve showed up with reddened knuckles and a vague story about catching his hand in a door. Meanwhile, at home, Steve's stepfather had noticed the absences. Not the library story that had worked for a while, but the way Steve came back with grease under his fingernails, smelling like motor oil and metal. The way he'd started carrying himself differently, standing straighter, meeting eyes instead of looking down. It happened on a Thursday evening. Steve was washing dishes, his mother was folding laundry in the living room, Lara was supposed to be doing homework. His stepfather came home early, went straight to Steve, grabbed his hand and examined the stains that wouldn't quite wash out. Where have you been going? The question was quiet, which was worse than yelling. Library. Working on a project. Don't lie to me. His stepfather's grip tightened on Steve's wrist. Libraries don't leave grease stains. Steve's mother appeared in the doorway, that familiar calculation happening behind her eyes. But something was different this time. Steve had been different, calmer, steadier, like he'd found something she'd lost. And maybe seeing that in her son reminded her of who she used to be. Let him go, she said. Her voice shook, but the words were clear. His stepfather turned, surprised. What did you say? I said let him go. She stepped forward, placed herself between them. Steve, take your sister to your room. She wasn't calculating the cost anymore. She was just protecting her children. Even as her hands trembled, even as fear made her voice thin, Steve didn't move, torn between obeying and staying to shield her. Now, she whispered, and he finally went, Lara's hand tight in his. From their room they heard yelling, doors slamming, then silence, then their mother's footsteps, slow and tired, heading to her bedroom. Steve pulled out his phone, stared at Luther's number for a long time before typing a message. Something happened. Don't know what to do. The response came within minutes. You did the right thing reaching out. We're here. Whatever you need. The next morning, Steve's stepfather was gone. His truck was still in the lot, his work boots still by the door, but the man himself had vanished. Cooling off somewhere, regrouping, deciding what came next. Their mother moved through the apartment like someone walking on ice, testing each step before committing weight to it. She didn't tell Steve not to go to the garage that Saturday. She didn't say anything at all. When Steve arrived, Luther was already waiting. He didn't ask what happened, just nodded toward the workbench where the completed car sat, purple paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Finished it last night, Luther said. Figured it was time. But before Steve could respond, Rita emerged from the small office at the back, Dr. Matthews beside her. The counselor had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner that made her seem less threatening than she probably needed to be. "Steve," Rita said carefully, "Dr. Matthews works at Lara's school. She'd like to talk with you, if that's okay." Every instinct told Steve to run, to lie, to protect the secret he'd been keeping. Instead, he sat down and told the truth. Came out in fragments. The broken car. His stepfather's rages that came like storms. You could see them building but couldn't stop them. His mother's frozen fear. Lara's silence. The way their apartment felt like holding your breath constantly, waiting for the next explosion. Dr. Matthews listened without interrupting, took notes without judgment. She'd already compiled her own observations, Lara's behavioral changes over the past year, the withdrawal, the way she startled at loud noises. Combined with Rita's concerns and Steve's account, a picture emerged that required action. "What happens now?" Steve asked, his voice smaller than he intended. "Now we make sure you're safe," Dr. Matthews said simply. "Your mother will need to be involved. This isn't about punishing anyone. It's about protection." The process moved faster than Steve expected. A social worker visited their apartment within days. His mother found herself sitting in an office explaining years of walking on eggshells while someone took notes. Before the week ended, his stepfather was packing his belongings under police supervision, a restraining order forcing distance where fear had kept them trapped. Steve's mother didn't transform into someone strong overnight. She cried a lot those first weeks. She apologized constantly, to Steve, to Lara, to caseworkers and counselors and the neighbor who'd heard yelling through the walls but never knew how to help. She attended court dates with shaking hands. She started seeing a therapist Rita had recommended. In those sessions, she learned that what she'd been calling keeping the peace had other names. Names that made her realize the violence hadn't only lived in raised voices and broken objects. But she also started looking her children in the eye again. Started asking Steve about the garage. Listening to Lara's quiet observations about her day. Started rebuilding something she'd let crumble. Not just their family, but herself. Luther helped Steve's mother navigate resources she didn't know existed. Rita connected her with a job program that offered better pay and stable hours. The Iron Talons, in their quiet way, became the safety net none of them had known they needed. By late summer, Luther approached Steve with an idea. "We're thinking of hosting an event," he said. "Junior Driver's Day. Kids from the youth shelter, single-parent homes, anywhere life's been rougher than it should be. They'd build small electric cars from salvaged parts, race them, take home something they made with their own hands." Steve understood immediately what Luther was really offering, a way to take what had saved him and extend it to others who might need saving. The event fell on the first Saturday of September. Dozens of kids showed up, from elementary schoolers to teenagers, each paired with a biker who'd teach them basic mechanics and let them get their hands dirty in the best possible way. Lara stood at Steve's workbench, her rebuilt remote car in her hands, watching younger kids wrestle with wire strippers and screwdrivers. She'd been talking more lately, not constantly, but enough. Drawing again, making those engine noises under her breath when she thought no one was listening. "Want to help me show them how the steering works?" Steve asked. She nodded, set the car down, and demonstrated the mechanism to a 7-year-old with careful patience. Steve watched his sister teach someone else something he'd taught her, watched her smile when the younger girl got it right, and felt something loosen in his chest. Their mother sat in a folding chair along the wall, watching her children move through the garage with confidence she'd forgotten they possessed. She'd brought lemonade, cookies she'd baked herself. Small gestures, but deliberate ones. Luther had told her about a support group for survivors that met Tuesday evenings. She'd gone once, planned to go again. As the afternoon sun slanted through the garage's high windows, Lara piloted her purple car through an obstacle course the bikers had constructed from scrap wood and old tires. Her laughter echoed off the concrete walls. Genuine, unguarded. The sound Steve had been trying to remember. Luther caught his eye across the garage and nodded. No words needed. They both understood what they'd built here went deeper than motors and circuits. Sometimes fixing broken things meant teaching a kid that asking for help wasn't weakness. Sometimes it meant showing a mother that protection could look like a garage full of bikers who gave a damn. Sometimes it meant a 13-year-old boy walking through a door carrying shattered pieces and trusting that someone on the other side would know what to do with them. Steve picked up a wrench, showed a 10-year-old how to tighten a bolt properly, and smiled. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is carry something broken to someone who knows how to help. Steve's courage didn't just fix a toy, it rebuilt his family's future. Have you ever had to be brave when the adults around you couldn't be? Share your thoughts below. And if this story moved you, subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary strength. See you in our next video.